All right, let's do this properly. Settle in, because this topic sounds simple, and then quietly flips your brain inside out. The psychology of truly knowing yourself. Let me start with a question that sounds innocent but is actually a trap. How well do you really know yourself? Not the name, age, favorite color, pizza topping version of you. I mean the real you. The one who says, "I'm fine," but takes a little too long to say it. The one who confidently gives advice to others, and then ignores that exact advice in their own life like it's spam email. Yeah, that version. Because here's the uncomfortable truth no one says out loud. Most people spend their entire lives being themselves without ever knowing themselves. That's not a joke. That's a psychological plot twist. The illusion of self-knowledge. We like to think we know who we are. I know myself. I'm just like this. That's how I've always been. But psychology says something quietly hilarious. You don't experience yourself directly. You experience your story about yourself. Think about it. You don't wake up and go, "Ah, yes, I am currently operating from unresolved emotional patterns formed during childhood." No. You wake up and go, "Why am I like this?" And then immediately check your phone. That story in your head, it's edited, it's biased, it skips scenes, and it always makes you the main character who is mostly right. Which explains why. You remember the one time you were wrong, but forget the 47 times you were right. You clearly remember how someone hurt you, but vaguely remember how you hurt them. You believe your intentions define you, but judge others by their actions. That's not hypocrisy. That's human psychology doing its thing. Your brain is not a truth machine. Here's something funny. Your brain's job is not to tell you the truth. Its job is to keep you safe, protect your identity, maintain emotional balance. Truth is optional. That's why your brain will rewrite memories, justify bad decisions, defend habits that are clearly not working, convince you that this time it's different. Ever argued with someone in your head, won the argument, felt proud, and then realized that person wasn't even there? Congratulations. You've experienced your brain protecting your self-image. And this is where self-knowledge gets tricky, because to truly know yourself, you have to be willing to see parts of you that your brain actively hides. The comfort of labels. Let's talk about labels. I'm an introvert. I'm just bad at relationships. I'm not a morning person. I have anger issues. These sound like self-awareness. Sometimes they are, but sometimes they're just emotional shortcuts. Labels can be helpful, but they can also be psychological parking spots. You stop exploring once you label. I procrastinate because that's just who I am. End of investigation. But what if procrastination isn't who you are? What if it's fear dressed as laziness? Perfectionism, pretending to be waiting for the right moment. Avoidance, wearing sweatpants. Self-knowledge doesn't stop at the label. It starts after the label. The mirror problem. Here's another fun psychological glitch. You see yourself through mirrors made of other people. Their reactions, their tone, their approval, their silence. That's why. Compliments feel addictive. Criticism feels personal. Rejection feels like identity damage. When people like you feel like a good person. When they don't, you suddenly start questioning your entire personality at 2:37 a.m. But here's the catch. People don't see you. They see how you make them feel. So if your self-image is built entirely on feedback, you don't actually know yourself. You know your reflection. And reflections change depending on the lighting. Why self-awareness feels uncomfortable. True self-knowledge is not a confidence boost. It's a discomfort generator. Because it forces you to admit things like, I avoid difficult conversations. I pretend not to care when I actually care a lot. I want approval more than I want to admit. I repeat patterns I swear I hate. And that hurts. It's much easier to say, this is just how life is, than to say, this is how I am contributing to my own problems. Psychology calls this ego defense. Normal humans call it, yeah, I'll think about that later. The gap between who you are and who you think you are. Here's where it gets interesting. There are actually 3 versions of you. 1, who you think you are. 2, who others think you are. 3, who you actually are. And most of your inner tension lives in the gaps between them. Example, you think you're calm. Others think you're distant. In reality, you're emotionally overwhelmed and don't know how to express it. You think you're honest. Others think you're blunt. In reality, you're afraid of vulnerability and hide it behind truth. You think you don't need anyone. Others think you're independent. In reality, you learned early not to rely on people. That's not personality. That's psychology. The stories you inherited. Here's something no one tells you early enough. A huge part of who you are was written before you were old enough to read. Your reactions, your triggers, your comfort zones, your fears. They didn't come from nowhere. They came from what you were praised for, what you were criticized for, what made you feel safe, what made you feel invisible. If you learned that love came with conditions, you might still be earning it. If you learned that emotions caused problems, you might still hide them. If you learned that being good meant being quiet, you might still struggle to speak up. Knowing yourself means asking, where did this part of me come from? Not to blame, but to understand. Why we avoid knowing ourselves. Let's be honest. Most people don't avoid self-knowledge because they're lazy. They avoid it because it threatens the familiar. If you truly understand yourself, you might have to change. And change is terrifying. Because change means letting go of old identities, outgrowing relationships, admitting past choices weren't aligned, accepting responsibility. It's much easier to stay confused than to face clarity that demands action. So the mind says, I'll work on myself. Someday. Someday is very busy. The subtle signs you're getting to know yourself. Here's the cool part. Self-knowledge doesn't arrive with fireworks. It shows up quietly. Like pausing before reacting, not needing to explain yourself as much, choosing peace over being right, catching yourself mid-pattern, laughing at your own nonsense. You stop saying, that's just how I am, and start saying, interesting, I do this when I feel like that. That tiny sentence, that's awareness. The paradox of knowing yourself. Here's the biggest twist of all. The more you truly know yourself, the less rigid you become. You stop clinging to identities. You stop defending every behavior. You stop pretending you're finished. You realize you're not a fixed personality. You're a pattern, a process, a work in progress with habits. And that's oddly freeing. Because if you're not broken, just patterned, you don't need fixing. You need understanding. A simple reality check. Let me leave you with this. If you've ever said, I don't know why I did that. I don't know why this keeps happening. I don't know why I feel this way. That's not failure. That's the doorway. Self-knowledge doesn't begin with answers. It begins with honest questions. And the bravest thing you can do, psychologically, is not to judge what you find. Just notice it. Because the moment you stop running from yourself, you stop being controlled by the parts you don't understand. And that's what truly knowing yourself feels like. Not loud, not dramatic, just quietly powerful. And maybe a little uncomfortable, which is how you know it's real.